This is Congress for the week of February 15th through 19th. This is the second module of our pre-recorded discussion. And let me pick off where I left off at the end of Module 1. And that was discussing the nature of an institution, and what I did not finish, which can be found on the second page of the notes from this last session, and also from Tuesday's voluntary Zoom session, where I spoke about the nature of institutions. I also wanted to talk about the kinds of criticisms that we make of our institutions and what standards lie behind different kinds of criticisms. And part of that discussion has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned in some ways previously, because of unintended consequences. So the connection between this discussion about the way we criticize our institutions in the light of what standards and what I was talking about in the previous module about the nature of institutions is to remind you of the complexity of institutions, and that when you try to change one part, you might reflect on how it affects other aspects of that institution. I should note, by the way, that just because life is complex, and because politics is complex, and because institutions are complex, doesn't mean that you should never change them simply because of the fear of unintended consequences. If we stopped trying to change things, either in our personal lives or our institutional lives or our political lives, simply because they may have effects that we cannot foresee, then we would know, as Aristotle reminds us in the Ethics, in the Nicomachean Ethics, human life is choice, and choice implies freedom and responsibility, and therefore, yes, we have a responsibility to make ourselves individually better, but we also have our responsibility to make our social and political lives better. And just because the effects of our attempts to make things better may prove problematic in the long run, well, again, that would paralyze us as human beings. Now, on the other hand, that means we have a responsibility to try to think through the consequences of our choices and our efforts of making things better, so that so far as we can see, we might avoid unintentional consequences. But I wanted to make sure that just because it's true that trying to make things better may actually end up making them worse, shouldn't deter one, either as an individual or as a society, from trying to make things better. I wanted to make that clear. But with that in mind, let's pick up with where my notes leave off on page 2 of the notes from this last session. So I'm reading from the top of page 2. Also, since our task is not only to understand or inform ourselves about the presidency or Congress or what other institution we're studying, but also to evaluate their performance, and as I already suggested in Tuesday's session, the beginning point of this class, and in some ways in reflection on Congress in general, is its remarkable unpopularity. So the fact that Americans generally are critical of their Congress, again, that's what causes us to reflect upon what standards we bring when we criticize institutions such as the one we are studying. Now, I turn this, or I reformulate this, as another way of asking this question is, what kind of critiques or criticisms do observers tend to make of our governing institutions? Other than things like Congress makes me want to throw up. By the way, that's actually a quote from a Supreme Court justice in Rochin v. California, 1952, when Justice Felix Frankfurter was trying to define what due process was, since the Constitution employs that term but doesn't define it. So the court has to apply these standards, so it has to say what's due process. And Rochin v. California had to do with a search and seizure case in which Rachin was a guy who was accused. The police had suspected him of drug dealing, and so they burst into his house where his wife and he were sleeping in the bedroom. And as they broke down the door to the bedroom, he grabbed a bunch of his illegal drugs and tried to flush some down the toilet and swallowed some. So when the police burst in, they grabbed him and they punched him in the stomach to try to make him throw up and turned him upside down, and then they dragged him to the hospital, I think, and pumped his stomach against his will without a warrant. And that case went up to the Supreme Court. Now, by the way, note that he wasn't that guilty of drug dealing, but the court overturned his conviction on the grounds that the police didn't exactly follow constitutional due process. Note, by the way, that Miranda v. Arizona, which everyone after 1965 has grown up with as police procedure, where you have to inform people that they have a right to remain silent. Miranda wasn't formulated until about 15 years after this case in 1952, and so when pushed, and Frankfurter wrote the opinion, and he said, due standard is the standard of civilized conduct. And in the oral argument, he was pressed, what do you mean by violations of civilized conduct? And he says, conduct that makes you want to throw up. So just because Congress makes us all want to throw up doesn't mean we are free from the obligation of stating the grounds of our criticism. So again, and I reformulate that in the next sentence, or again, what makes somebody tend to think there's something wrong with an institution? And how do we know, or how does one know, when it is working correctly or right? Any criticism obviously implies the existence of standards by which you are judging something. And so the point of these remarks is to make us aware of the kinds of critiques, institutional critiques you can make, and what kind of standards are behind them. I'm not taking a position on the validity or the undesirability of any of these critiques, but I think it is important to note that when it comes to our institutions, there are four typical or standard kinds of critiques. The first one I discuss is what I call ideological critiques, where the institution is held accountable to some abstract principle. So, example, to abolish the Electoral College. Why do people want to abolish the Electoral College? Although after this last election, even people on the left who hated the Electoral College after the election of 2016 came to kind of appreciate the Electoral College in the election of 2020. But the main criticism, and if you've had me for American government, we've worked through this, and we'll look at it next year in the presidency. But obviously, people argue that the Electoral College is undemocratic because it actually divides the presidential election up, the single national presidential election up into 50 state presidential elections, and awards electoral votes, which are assigned both on the basis of population and also Senate representation, and that's why there are 538 electoral votes in the Electoral College, because there are 434 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, and the 23rd Amendment awards 3 electoral votes to the inhabitants of the District of Columbia. So, generally speaking, people approach the Electoral College and say it needs to be reformed because it is a violation of the principle of one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. Now, we should note that formulation is not in the Constitution, and even though our concern is Congress in this course, you should note the same criticism that people make of the Electoral College is the same criticism that people make of the Senate, and that is that take, for instance, representation in the House. California, because it is the most populous state, at least at this point, has 53 representatives, and Wyoming, which is has about 400,000 individuals, I think, residents, has 1 representative. Now you can say, wait a minute, obviously in the House. California has more weight than Wyoming does. But in the Senate, of course, where all the states are represented as states, regardless of population, the 400,000 people in Wyoming have just as much representation as the 35 million people in California. So even though in the House, the principle of one person, one vote, or the idea that one American's vote weighs as much as another American's vote, obviously in the Senate and therefore in the Electoral College, that's not true. So some people in the last year or a couple of years have raised the argument that there should be a constitutional amendment to change the nature of the Senate so that both the House and the Senate are based upon proportionate representation of the American people. Now, my point here is not to say that that's a bad criticism or anything like that, but that's not rooted in the argument that the Senate is dysfunctional or anything like that. It's rooted in the argument that the Electoral College or the Senate or something like that violates some principle of democratic equality. Now, democratic equality is an important principle in the Constitution, but because we're going to see when we look at the origins of Congress and what Congress was designed to do, the complex difference between representation of the American people in the House and of the states in the Senate had to do with the complex nature of the American Union. Now we'll see, for instance, when we look at some of the antecedents, the institutional antecedents of Congress, which is a bicameral institution. And is it a bicameral institution because the House of because Parliament was a bicameral institution, and we copied Britain's institutions when we formed our own? Well, you'll see that again, as I mentioned previously, that, and when we turn to this material in a little bit, that narrative is false. There is a certain resonance between our institutions and British institutions, or even prior institutions. Our discussion will go as far back as the Roman Republic and the Roman Constitution, but that narrative in some ways isn't true because the Congress is not bicameral because the Parliament was bicameral. It's bicameral because the Union of the United States of America is a complex union composed of both a national population, the American people, we the people of the United States, and also the semi-sovereign states. So that's an ideological critique. A second kind of critique is a power critique that an institution has too much or too little power. So since the Vietnam War, for instance, a common critique of the presidency, and regardless of who's occupying the presidency or what party is in the presidency, is that the president has become too powerful in our constitutional system. By the way, that critique raised its head at the beginning of the Biden administration this last January, because President Biden, within a week or two, issued 47 executive orders, partially in an attempt to overturn the influence and executive orders of President Trump. And we all understand that executive orders can undo executive orders, although that issue is itself complex. But the point is people are criticizing President Nixon during during the Vietnam War, which led, by the way, to the passage of the War Powers Act in 1973, an attempt to limit presidential power, but then surfaces against a Democratic president for using executive orders. And even some Democrats and progressives are troubled by the resort to presidential governance as an attempt to get around Congress, if that's in fact what's going on. But my point here is this criticism starts from the assumption that power is being misused because there's too much power. I mentioned when I was talking about the criticisms of Congress and some of the authors that we're going to consider, and I have used in this course before, like Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, and I mentioned their books in Tuesday's discussion, and we will read selections of that book in later on in the course. Their earlier book, The Broken Branch, and their their second book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. In some ways, their criticism of Congress is that Congress has yielded up significant portions of power to the executive branch, and that in some ways the excesses of presidential government and the dysfunctionality of Congress as an institution has to do with the fact that the balance of power has shifted from the legislature to the executive. Well, we will articulate that criticism. All I mean to say is that in some ways that's not a criticism about. It is a criticism of the way the institution is functioning, and it attempts to explain that by the idea that this particular institution isn't exercising sufficient power or something, and that this imbalance leads to institutional dysfunction. A third kind of critique, and I actually think this is probably the most common critique that people make of our institutions, is policy critiques. That people work back from a policy that they want or criticize, and therefore assume that because the institution failed to produce that policy, it implies institutional dysfunction. I actually think this is, aside from the abstract ideological critique, this actually tends to be the most common source of criticism of our institutions. So, and even some of you voiced something like this when we were talking about the ugly spectacle of Congress's inability, either under President Trump or potentially under President Biden, the inability of Congress to formulate a second coherent COVID relief package, since they did in fact pass one in May. And some of you suggested that, doesn't that in and of itself suggest that there's something the matter with Congress? Possibly. But as you'll see, policy critiques tend to often emerge from partisanship, and as you're going to see, that's, I think, what I want to warn us about more than anything else. That it's a dangerous thing to try to reform institutions in the midst of partisan rancor, because oftentimes you'll change in order to produce a certain policy. You change some aspect of the institution's functioning, and then it turns out that when your party loses power, then the party in power that takes over will then use that reform against you. And that, I think, is indeed the great dividing line between constitutionalism and thinking about institutions on the constitutional level, and the everyday partisan, oftentimes urgent politics that we find ourselves in. I'll give you a quick example, and probably that, as I've already mentioned by discussing the syllabus, when it comes to the Senate, the most controversial aspect of Senate functioning is the filibuster. And the filibuster has evolved over time in the Senate. And it became the filibuster in its operation, which requires, by the way, let's be clear, what we call it, and we'll go over this background of the filibuster later on in the course when we turn to this. But the filibuster refers to the fact that the Senate actually allows an individual or a determined minority to hold the floor, which nothing like that exists in the House. The House is a purely majoritarian body. But the Senate prizes itself on free speech and the individual dignity of each senator, and therefore they allow senators this remarkable privilege of holding the floor as long as they can or want. More about that later, of course. And this has to do with parliamentary procedure and everything. And and the filibuster has been modified from time to time. The last modification was in the 1970s, when the threshold of overturning a filibuster went from 2/3, which would be 66 to 67 senators, to they lowered the threshold to 3/5, which is 60. And that's why people think that it's a constitutional requirement that legislation pass the Senate with a 60-vote margin. As you're going to see, the Constitution simply requires a simple majority for legislation to pass, unless it's to override a presidential veto or to pass a constitutional amendment or to convict somebody of an impeachable offense. There are supermajorities which the Constitution does require of certain processes, but for passing legislation, a 60-vote margin is not one of them. That's a Senate custom. And to remind you, by the way, that when I was talking about the elements of an institution, that's why you have to, in addition to looking at the function, the constitutional dimensions, the power or function, the structure, and the process, you also have to look at something called the history of the institution and the personality of the institution. For instance, by the end of the 20th century, the filibuster in the Senate had been extended not only to legislative matters, which is what its origin was, but also to judicial appointments. Until under President Clinton, when the Republicans retook both houses of Congress, several of President Clinton's appointees were being blocked, and then, of course, President Bush won the presidency in 2000 and 2004, and then President Obama became president in 2008 and 2012. Well, Harry Reid, who was the majority leader in that latter period, because when President Obama was elected in 2008, he won a supermajority in the Senate and a majority of members of the House, so both houses became Democratic after having been shifted to the Republican Party since the mid-90s. So the Republicans were blocking, using the filibuster to block judicial appointments of President Obama, so Harry Reid had the Senate change its rules to abandon the filibuster when it came to lower judicial appointees. And then when President Trump won the presidency and nominated Neil Gorsuch and then subsequently Kavanaugh and Barrett, especially with Gorsuch, the Republicans voted because it only takes a majority, a simple majority in the Senate, to change the rules. And that's what was discussed as the nuclear option. And the Senate, under the Republicans, under Majority Leader McConnell, abolished the filibuster for judicial appointments, for Supreme Court appointments. And that's how, of course, they managed to get Trump's 3 judicial nominees on the court. Now that the Democrats are in power, and understand how fragile that is, since the Senate is 50-50. Remember, of course, it's the fact that Vice President Harris only votes as president of the Senate when there is a tie vote. So my point here is that when under the Majority Leader Reid, when the Democrats abolished the filibuster for lower judicial appointments, the argument the Republicans made is, you'll regret this. And they did regret it. And the Republicans will probably regret abolishing the filibuster for judicial appointments when President Biden comes. It comes time for President Biden if there should become a vacancy on the court. So my point is, policy critiques tend to emerge out of partisan policy differences of opinion. And it's a warning to people that would reform institutions that when you start messing with their fundamental structure because you want to achieve a policy end, you may come to regret that later on. So the last kind of critique is what I call constitutional critiques. And this is, of course, this is unavoidable in a political system that has a written constitution. Because obviously, as Chief Justice Marshall says in Marbury v. Madison in 1803, in which most of you know that he articulated the principle of judicial review, the power of the court to declare the actions of the other branches of the federal government unconstitutional. What's the point of a written constitution but to provide limits for the governing institutions of society? And so you could say the idea that that we use the Constitution to criticize our governing institutions obviously is implicit in the idea of a written constitution. But again, you have to be careful about that. So, for instance, let me just go back to the presidency and executive orders. President Obama, when he formulated through an executive order the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Children, whatever, I forget what the second A in DACA is, he initiated that by executive order. And then came under criticism but that's a violation of using the presidential pardoning power, which the president does have, and which prosecutorial discretion, which is part of executive power, whether or not to prosecute a crime under certain circumstances, to use the broad swath of presidential prosecutorial discretion to invalidate a whole swath of congressional legislation, such as our immigration laws. Obama was criticized, and then, of course, when Trump came into office, he used his executive authority to try to undo DACA. And then when President Biden came into office, he again resorted to executive authority, discretion, to put a moratorium on deportations. I'm not taking a position on any of these things. All I mean to say is there is in Article 2, Section 3, the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And it's a constitutional critique of those actions to say those actions exceeded the constitutional grant of power or the proper functioning of that institution. Now, we'll encounter all four kinds of these critiques. And the whole point of this discussion, again, is not to say that we should never change or reform our institutions, but if I may combine the point I'm making by the discussion of these different kinds of critiques and connect it with the larger point I made in the first module about the nature of institutions. If you're going to reform an institution to make it more, say, representative by instituting term limits, that will limit members of the House or Senate to a specific number of years, and then force that office to be vacated so that, say, if you limit terms to 4 terms in the House, 8 years, that means you can't build up this sort of permanent power elite, and that elections will become more competitive. That may be true, and it may be true that more competitive elections will make the House more representative of the American people. But does that mean that it will be able to perform its other constitutional functions better, as I suggested in the first module? Or, again, if you change one aspect of an institution, you may actually undermine another aspect. So, the thoughtful constitutionalist and the thoughtful student of our institutions has to take all of these things into account. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to turn to the second major topic of our discussion from Tuesday and the notes, and that is to begin discussing the historical and theoretical antecedents and background of the Congress. What you should have in front of you, by the way, is either the selections from Locke, which I printed out and passed out to you, this great comparogram diagram of what Congress is and isn't, and the notes that I'm reading from for this session, Roman numeral 3, Locke, Britain, and the Theoretical Historical Origins of Congress. So, the first thing I talk about is British constitutional history. But what I want to direct you to right now is the comparogram. I actually want to go, because Davidson and Olezek pushed their discussion of the origins of Congress, or the antecedents, to Britain and then the colonies and then the states. And that is an important background for understanding the construction of the Congress. But the reason I want to broaden that a bit is to make you aware of the fact that the creation of the Congress, just like the creation of the presidency and the Supreme Court, and our institutions of national governments under the great constitutional reform of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that produced the Constitution was part of a larger reform of the nature of government and politics, which undergirded the whole founding. And in particular, again, the generation of the American Constitution and the institutions under which we live, when I say it was part of a larger reform of the nature of politics, is, and this is something I'm talking about in my American political thought class, but also talk about in American government, is our Constitution and the ideas that undergird it in our political life come from a certain set of philosophic ideas which were generated by modern political philosophy and philosophers such as Machiavelli, René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, Thomas Hobbes especially, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, David Hume, Adam Smith, and other great thinkers. Our political life, in other words, is founded, as is the politics of most of the modern world, upon a certain view of politics and human beings that emerged in modern political philosophy and actually found its initial expression in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. They're driving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so, as we'll see, what that led to eventually in the creation of our Constitution was, indeed, the most democratic set of institutions that humanity had ever seen up till that point. And so, to understand why, for instance, we have a bicameral Congress, and why the Senate is constructed the way it is, and why the House is, and to understand how there are resonances of prior politics and political orders in our institutional arrangements, yet it's important to understand, again, as I say on my comparogram, what the Congress and Constitution isn't. And so, if I may direct your attention to the Roman Republic. In political theory and political philosophy, from going back to ancient political philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle and the Roman Republic, there is a certain sense in which the guiding idea... Let's back up and just actually say what the core issue of political philosophy is and politics, and that is the common good. Politics, when I defined it in my American government class or in political theory, when we read these great philosophers, I defined politics as the activity of a group of human beings, a community, trying to formulate the common good. Now, people like Machiavelli have argued that, and if you've had ancient political philosophy, you've read the Republic, you know that Socrates gets the sophist Thrasymachus so mad at the end of Book 1 of the Republic, that he gets up and starts shouting at Socrates, who claims that justice is real and it's the common good. And he says, and Thrasymachus stands up and shouts and he says, "Socrates, you filthy liar! There's no such thing as the common good. It's just power, and what we call justice is just the advantage of the stronger party in society oppressing the weaker party." Well, that's been an important theme in political life for the beginning, and it may be true. But the point is most authors and commentators, and probably most of us, expect that what politics should produce is the common good. Now, as we're going to see, the same insight that leads to the advocacy of what was generally considered to be the best form of government by many political authors, the mixed regime. I want to discuss that concept and how that led to a certain set of arrangements, first in the Roman Republic and then in the British Empire and the British Constitution, which did, in fact, form part of the antecedents of our legislature. And the point I want to make here is that the set of deliberations that that informed the creation of the Congress is actually an abandonment of the idea of the mixed regime. Now, if politics is supposed to produce the common good, we are all aware of the fact that there are contending interests and different parts of society that conflict with each other and attempt to control the government so as to turn the government into an instrument of their own private good. Whether it's a tyrant or a wealthy class of aristocratic nobles or whatever, And even Madison in Federalist 10, which we'll talk about next week, argues that you can't have a society of human beings that doesn't have a set of contending or conflicting interests. It's not until you get to thinkers like Marx and in some ways utopian socialism that argues that all class conflict or all factional conflict can be eliminated by a fundamental reform of the human condition. Well, as you're going to see, the framers did not accept that, although the nature of the factional conflict that undergirds society and that does become part of the reflection about representation means in Congress, that the framers did share with prior authors. But if you're looking at the comparogram, what was the idea of the mixed regime? The mixed regime was an attempt to arrange institutions in such a way that their mutual interaction with each other would almost by definition produce the common good. Now, starting with the oldest reflection on human society, we note, as Aristotle says, as Plato says, and as Madison says, the most common arrangement of conflict in society was probably an economic one or a class one between the rich and the poor. And in most political society, which I'm talking about in de Tocqueville in my American Political Thought class, the division between rich and poor throughout most of historical society was a class conflict that was embodied in hereditary aristocracy, where supposedly these few aristocratic families in every society, whether you're talking about China, Japan, India, the Mayans, the Aztecs, Europe, where all of society was ruled by a tiny elite of supposedly noble families, either descended from the gods or chosen by nature, their superiority. But in reality, as Aristotle points out, most of these aristocracies were actually oligarchies, where you had a small number of people, the rich, controlling the resources of society. Now, if society is going to, and again, you needed a thinker like Marx to argue that the solution to that was to to cut the heads of the rich off or shoot them with machine guns and make them disappear as a class. The theory of the mixed regime, which guided politics up until the American Constitution, was that you couldn't simply fix society by killing everyone off who disagreed with you or who represented a different interest. Now, so it's true. The theory of the mixed regime starts with the presumption that the great social divisions that characterize most of historical human society are there to stay, and that somehow the task of creating the common good for society institutionally, and here's the core theory of the mixed regime, is to give each of the major and permanent segments of society an institutional expression of their own, and that in arranging the institutions with each other, you would force the institutional life of the constitution of that society to produce the common good. So if you're looking at the comparogram, I'll just read what I said because I express it so well. The common good of society is attained by institutionalizing the existing social classes and divisions, which means giving each social or economic interest its own institutional embodiment. And the second part then, arranging the powers of the institution so that policy can only be formulated by including them all in an overall balance. And many of you have seen remnants of ancient Roman, like in movie pictures, or you've read actually these things called history books. One of the symbols of Roman authority was the fasces, the bundle of rods and axes, and the symbol SPQR. Senatus Populusque Romae, the Senate and the people of Rome. Rome was originally a monarchy, and then with aristocratic noble families, and then because of political conflict, the monarchy was abolished, and the republic came into being. But the republic really was an oligarchic domination of the senatorial or patrician families. So by the time of the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, Rome had become a republic in the sense that there was both an institutional embodiment of the interest of the patrician class, the noble and wealthy aristocrats, and the the military generals, because Rome was, of course, a military republic and eventually a military empire, and ultimately the vast majority of the poor people. Don't forget, by the way, that Rome, like all ancient societies, was a slave society, and that 60% of the Roman population were slaves. We're not even talking about the slaves of the Roman Empire. We're just talking about the free, poor people. And so by the time that the Roman Republic had formulated itself right up to the point where Julius Caesar and his nephew Octavius overthrew the Republic and instituted the emperorship, you had essentially three kinds of institutions governing Rome: the Senate, the consuls, which were temporary elected dictators in military crisis, and tribunes, which were originally 2 or 3 representatives chosen by the people at large, who would then speak for the people in the Senate. So if I may read the comment to explain this arrangement. The patricians were the hereditary aristocracy and wealthy oligarchy derived from the founding families of Rome. The people were the free citizens of Rome, not the slaves, as I mentioned, and the generals who led its military forces, which were understood to fight for the common good of the city. Originally, the Senate ruled Rome after the overthrow of the Tarquin kings. And if you've had modern political philosophy, or you've read Shakespeare's, the overthrow of the Tarquin kings was precipitated by the rape of a famous Roman woman, Lucretia in Machiavelli's version of it, and because of the shock of that outrage, the kingship was abolished. And then, as I mentioned, the tribunes were individuals selected by the people. In times of crisis, a dictator would be appointed. One of the consuls was typically appointed a dictator until the cessation of the emergency, and eventually the consulate emerged as the balancing institution of the republic. As I mentioned before, Rome's banner was SPQR, Senatus Populus Quae Romae, the Senate and the people of Rome. So Rome had evolved a kind of a Senate. Now, the tribunes, by the way, was not a popular body like the House of Representatives or House of Commons. It was only a couple of individuals that nevertheless were elected by the people at large, so they did represent the popular element. And then the executive branch kind of was like the ruling military element. So that was how the common good was arranged in the mixed regime. I'm going to stop here because we reached the limit of our 40 to whatever minute module. So I'll finish this discussion in the 3rd module, and then prepare us for our consideration of the formation of Congress and its historical development.